The unexpected delivery. Max had been a mail carrier in the small town of Glenbrook for 3 years. He knew everyone by name, from the friendly old ladies on Maple Street to the young families on Oak Avenue. His route was simple, the houses well kept, and the people warm. But there was one address that always made him uncomfortable. It was a run-down building at the edge of town, hidden behind tall, rusted fences and overgrown weeds. It was where the local gang, the Red Hawks, hung out. Max had always tried to avoid that house. He had heard stories about the gang's activities, loud arguments, strange cars coming and going at odd hours, and rumours of illegal dealings. But his job was straightforward. Deliver the mail and move on. He didn't ask questions, and he certainly didn't want to get involved. One Friday afternoon, Max was nearing the end of his route. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. He had already dropped off most of his packages and letters, but there was one left. He looked at the address on the label. It was the one he dreaded, the Red Hawks building. He sighed and checked the time. He could just leave it at the door, but Max knew he had to get a signature for certain packages. This was one of those packages. It was big, heavy, and required someone to sign for it. He could leave a note and come back tomorrow, but that meant another day of worrying. So he decided to just get it over with. Max pulled his bike to a stop in front of the gang's building. He hesitated for a moment, looking at the broken windows and the graffiti-covered walls. His hand tightened on the package. He glanced around, making sure no one was watching. He didn't want to seem weak, but his nerves were getting the best of him. He pushed open the creaky gate and walked up to the front door. As he approached, he heard laughter and shouting from inside. It sounded like a party, or maybe a meeting. He didn't know which was worse. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a leather jacket, the Red Hawks logo stitched on the back. His face was serious, but his eyes narrowed when he saw the package in Max's hands. "You Max, the mail guy?" the man asked gruffly. Max nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, I've got a package for you. It needs a signature." The man looked at the package, then back at Max. His eyes flickered with something Max couldn't quite read. Without saying anything, he stepped aside and gestured for Max to come in. "Come on in. Don't stand out there like you're scared. We won't bite," the man said with a cold smile. Max's heart raced. He didn't want to go inside, but he knew he had no choice. He needed the signature, and this wasn't a place to argue. He stepped inside, trying to keep calm, but every part of him was on high alert. The smell of cigarette smoke and cheap cologne hit him immediately. The room was dark, filled with people talking loudly and laughing. It looked like a scene from a movie, people leaning against the walls, sitting on old couches and playing cards. The man who had opened the door led Max to the back of the room where a long table was set up. On one side of the table sat 2 men Max recognized from the town, but he had no idea who the others were. They all looked up when Max entered, their eyes taking in the young mailman. There was a quiet tension in the air, a moment of silence before someone spoke. "You the mail guy?" one of the men asked, a sharp smile on his face. He had tattoos running up his arms, and his voice was low and grating. Max nodded, trying not to let his fear show. "Yeah, I've got a package for you. It needs to be signed." The man didn't move immediately. He looked at Max for a moment, sizing him up. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen. Without saying anything, he signed the package and handed it back to Max. "That it?" the man asked, his tone casual but cold. Max blinked, feeling the weight of the moment. He had expected something more trouble, more conflict, but the situation seemed almost ordinary. There was no fight, no argument. The man had signed, and now Max could leave. Max looked around the room one last time. The tension was still there, but it wasn't as thick as before. It was almost as if the gang members didn't care about him anymore. Maybe they were busy with something else, or maybe they were just waiting for him to leave. He nodded quickly. "Yeah, that's it. Thanks." As Max turned to leave, he felt someone grab his arm. He froze, his heart pounding. "Hold on a second." The voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Max turned around slowly. The man who had signed the package was standing right behind him, his face closer now. "You're not in any trouble, male guy, but you need to be careful around here." Max tried to pull away, but the grip on his arm tightened slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. The man gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We don't like strangers poking around too much. You've been real quiet, real good about not asking questions, and that's fine. But you don't want to find yourself in a bad situation, got it?" Max nodded quickly, relieved that the grip on his arm loosened. He wasn't sure if he was more scared of the gang or the idea of being caught up in something he didn't understand. He didn't want to know what happened in this house, but the more he stayed, the more it felt like they were keeping an eye on him. "Yeah, I got it. I'll be more careful next time," Max said, his voice quieter than usual. "Good," the man said, giving him a nod. "Now get out of here." Max didn't need to be told twice. He quickly walked toward the door, feeling the eyes of the gang members on him as he left. He stepped outside, his heart still pounding in his chest. The cold air hit him, and for the first time that day, he felt like he could breathe again. But as he made his way back to his bike, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had just delivered a simple package, but now he was tangled up in something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The gang, the coldness, the warnings. It was all too much. And somehow, Max knew that this would not be the last time he would come into contact with the Red Hawks. Caught in the web. The next few days were uneventful for Max, but the feeling of unease that lingered after his visit to the Red Hawks' hideout never quite left him. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that he had done his job, delivered the package, and that was it. The world would go on. But his mind kept drifting back to the gang, to the warning he had received. What exactly did they mean by "don't ask questions"? Max's route had become routine again, delivering packages, dropping off letters, the usual small-town interactions. But something in his stomach twisted every time he passed the old building on the edge of town. He couldn't help but wonder, had they been watching him that day? Were they waiting for him to make a mistake? That afternoon, Max was delivering a package to the local coffee shop when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a text from his mum or a friend, but instead it was a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me at the corner of Elm and Maple at 6 p.m. tonight. Don't bring anyone." Max's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, his hands trembling slightly. It was from the Red Hawks. He was sure of it. But why? What did they want from him? He had done nothing but deliver a package. Still, he couldn't ignore it. He had no choice. The gang wasn't the type to leave people alone, and he knew he couldn't just brush this off. He glanced around the coffee shop, as if hoping for some sign that this was a mistake, but the room was busy, the sounds of people chatting and clinking cups filling the air. Max pocketed his phone and finished the rest of his route. his mind racing the entire time. When he got home that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the street, but the town was quiet. Max tried to distract himself, going through his mail and getting ready for the next day, but the message on his phone kept flashing in his mind. At 5:45 p.m., Max grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. His steps felt heavier with each moment. He knew he was walking into something dangerous, but he couldn't turn back. If he didn't show up, who knew what would happen? Max arrived at the corner of Elm and Maple just before 6 p.m. The street was dimly lit, and the air was cool with the evening breeze. He stood at the corner, his eyes scanning the shadows. He felt vulnerable out here, alone, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to jump out at him. The minutes stretched on, and just as Max was starting to think that maybe this was some sick joke, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the same man who had signed for the package that day, the one with the tattoos and the cold smile. He walked toward Max with purpose, his boots making quiet thuds on the pavement. Max could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "You came," the man said, his voice low and serious. "I didn't have much of a choice," Max replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "What do you want from me?" The man smirked. "It's not about what we want from you. It's about what you can do for us." Max felt a chill run down his spine. "I don't know what you mean." The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You delivered a package for us, and you didn't ask any questions. That's good. We like people who do their job and keep quiet, but sometimes there's more to the job than just handing over a box. You'll learn that soon enough." Max was confused. What did this have to do with him? He was just a mailman. This wasn't his world. He was getting in over his head. "Listen, I don't want any part in whatever this is," Max said, his voice shaking despite himself. "I just do my job, okay?" The man smiled again, but it wasn't friendly. "That's the thing, Max. You already are part of it, and now you're going to help us." Max took a step back, his stomach tight. "Help you? How?" The man paused, looking Max up and down. "There's a delivery. We need someone to take it to a place in the next town over. You're perfect for the job. You're already working with us, and no one's going to question a mailman." Max's heart sank. He didn't want any part of this. He wasn't a criminal, wasn't involved in any illegal activity, but what choice did he have? The man's eyes were cold, unblinking, and Max knew that refusing them wasn't an option. "I'll do it," Max said quietly, feeling the weight of the decision. "But this is the last time." The man grinned. "We'll see about that. Meet me tomorrow at the same time, and I'll have the package ready for you." Max nodded, his mind racing. As the man walked away, he stood frozen in the street, trying to process what had just happened. His thoughts were a whirlwind. He was just a mailman. How had he gotten pulled into this world, and how could he get out? Max spent the night unable to sleep, his thoughts spinning. He had agreed to take the package, but what if that was a mistake? What if it was a trap? He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he had no other choice. The Red Hawks had their grip on him now, and there was no easy way to break free. Into the abyss. The next morning, Max woke up feeling as though he were carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. The promise he had made to the Red Hawks was starting to feel like a mistake. He had never been involved in anything like this before. Delivering packages for the mail service was simple, routine. But now, everything had changed. He wasn't just delivering mail. He was stepping into a world he didn't understand, a world full of danger and uncertainty. Max spent the morning trying to distract himself. He finished his mail route as quickly as he could, delivering letters and packages without thinking about the meeting that awaited him later. He found himself looking over his shoulder more often, certain that someone was following him, but he saw nothing unusual. Glenbrook was quiet, as it always was. No one seemed to know about the web of trouble that Max had unwittingly walked into. At noon, he stopped at a small cafe to grab a coffee and a sandwich. The food didn't taste right, and the coffee was bitter, but he drank it anyway. He needed something to calm his nerves, though he knew deep down that nothing could ease the fear gnawing at him. The hours passed slowly until the time for his meeting with the Red Hawks arrived. Max felt the weight of every second as he walked to the same corner where he had met the man the night before. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with questions. What was in the package? Who would he have to meet? What would happen next? When he arrived, the man was already waiting for him, leaning against the same lamppost. His expression was unreadable, but Max could see the slight glint of anticipation in his eyes. The man's eyes scanned the street, watching for anyone who might be approaching. "You're here," the man said, his voice flat. Max nodded, though he didn't know what to say. He had agreed to help, but he didn't know what to expect next. He had no experience with the criminal world, and yet it seemed like it was dragging him in deeper and deeper. "I'm ready," Max said, his voice shaky despite his best effort to sound confident. The man grinned, an expression that sent a chill down Max's spine. "Good. Follow me." They walked in silence for several blocks, the man leading the way. Max stayed close behind, trying to keep a low profile. The man led him to a nondescript building on the edge of town, the kind of place Max had passed countless times but had never paid much attention to. He had no idea what was inside, but something about it made him uneasy. "Stay here," the man said, stopping in front of the door. "I'll get the package. You don't move until I come back." Max nodded silently. He watched the man disappear inside the building, and for a brief moment he thought about running. He could leave now, just walk away and never look back. But he knew better. If he left now, the Red Hawks would come after him. He wasn't sure what they would do, but he wasn't willing to find out. He stood there, shifting from foot to foot, looking around nervously. The street was quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Max felt like he was in a dream, as though none of this was real. But everything about it felt too real. He was involved now, and there was no going back. After what felt like an eternity, the man reappeared, holding a small brown package wrapped in plain paper. He didn't say anything as he handed it to Max, but his eyes told Max everything he needed to know. This was serious. This wasn't just another delivery. Max took the package, his fingers brushing against the rough surface of the paper. It felt heavier than it should have, and there was something about the way it was wrapped that made him uneasy. He stared at it for a moment before looking up at the man. "Where do I take this?" Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man pointed toward the road. "Head south, about 30 miles. There's an old warehouse on the outskirts of Riverstone. Leave the package there, and don't ask any questions. Just drop it off and come back." Max felt his stomach tighten. He had never been to Riverstone, and the thought of going there alone made him nervous, but the man was already turning away, his back to Max. "Go, we'll be watching." Max nodded, though he wasn't sure if the man could see him. He turned and began walking toward his bike, the package still heavy in his hands. His mind was racing. 30 miles was a long distance. What was inside the package? Why was it so important? And why had they chosen him to deliver it? As he rode his bike toward Riverstone, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The Red Hawks had already involved him in something he didn't understand. Now they were sending him to deliver a mysterious package to a warehouse in the middle of nowhere. Everything about it screamed danger, and Max knew that if he didn't play by their rules, he might not make it back. The ride felt like it took forever. The roads were empty, and the town of Riverstone seemed distant and cold as Max pedaled along the winding path. His thoughts were a whirlwind, confusion, fear, and guilt all swirling together. How had he gotten himself into this mess? He wasn't a bad person, but now he was carrying out tasks for a gang, just because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the time Max reached Riverstone, the sun had started to set. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, but Max barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, where he could see the outline of the old warehouse in the distance. It was run down and abandoned, just as the man had described. It didn't look like a place for anyone to be, let alone a delivery. Max parked his bike and walked cautiously toward the entrance. The building was silent, and the air smelled of dust and decay. As he approached, he heard a faint sound coming from inside. Footsteps, shuffling across the floor. Max's heart skipped a beat, and he hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. When he reached the door, he stopped. His hand was shaking as he reached for the handle, and the weight of the package felt like it had doubled in size. This was it. He was in too deep now, and there was no turning back. Max opened the door, stepping inside the dark warehouse. The silence was deafening, and he could feel the eyes of someone watching him from the shadows. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he took a step forward. "Just leave it on the table," a voice said, cold and harsh. Max froze, his pulse quickening. He didn't know who was speaking, but he knew this wasn't a simple delivery anymore. Something much bigger was at play, and he was right in the middle of it. No going back. Max's heart raced as the door to the warehouse creaked shut behind him. The dim light of the fading sun barely illuminated the vast, empty space. The floor was covered in dust, and the air felt thick, stale with neglect. It was the kind of place people avoided, a building that looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The voice had come from the shadows, but Max couldn't see anyone. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but his nerves were getting the best of him. The package in his hands felt heavier than ever. It was as if its weight had grown with the tension in the room. "Leave it on the table," the voice repeated. It was low and commanding, but there was an edge to it that made Max's skin crawl. Max turned his head toward the source of the voice. He could just make out a shape standing near a large, rickety table at the far side of the warehouse. It was a tall figure, cloaked in shadow. The person seemed to be waiting, and Max couldn't tell if they were expecting him or simply observing. He took a step forward, trying to move as quietly as possible, the package clutched tightly in his hands. His shoes squeaked on the dusty floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Each movement felt deliberate, like he was walking deeper into something he could not control. When he reached the table, the figure stepped out of the shadows. Max froze. It was a woman. She was taller than he expected, with long, dark hair that hung in a tangled mass around her face. Her eyes were cold, almost predatory, and they fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he didn't. He couldn't. He had to finish this, had to leave the package and get out of here. Max placed the package on the table slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he released it. The woman didn't say anything at first, just stared at him with those piercing eyes. Then she reached for the package, her fingers brushing against the rough brown paper. She tilted her head slightly, examining it with a strange interest. "You've done well," she said, her voice smooth but carrying a hint of danger. "But you've made a choice, Max, a choice you can't undo." Max's stomach tightened. He had been dreading this moment, the moment when he realized he was too deep to get out. He had hoped that once he delivered the package, they would leave him alone, that everything would go back to normal. But it was clear now that things would never be the same. "I just did what you asked," Max said, trying to keep his voice steady, though it cracked slightly. "I want to go home. I've done my part. That's it, right? I'm done." The woman laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You think it's that simple? You think they'll just let you walk away? You've seen too much now, Max. You're part of this whether you like it or not." Max felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He didn't belong here. This wasn't his world. He didn't know anything about gangs or criminal activities. He was just a mailman, trying to do his job. But now, the Red Hawks had pulled him into their web, and there was no way out. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. She reached for the package, and as her fingers brushed against it, Max felt a jolt of fear. He didn't know what was inside, but it was clear that whatever it was important. It was dangerous. "You're going to have to prove your loyalty, Max," she said, her voice low and almost soothing, as if she were explaining something to a child. "This is just the beginning. There are things you don't understand, and soon you will." Max's mind raced. Prove his loyalty? What did that even mean? He had already done what they asked. He had delivered the package, but now it seemed like that wasn't enough. They wanted more from him. "I don't want anything to do with this," Max said, shaking his head, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not a criminal. I don't belong here." The woman's expression hardened. "You think we care about what you want? This isn't about you, Max. It's about what's best for us. And right now, you're part of the plan." Before Max could respond, there was a noise behind him, a soft shuffle of feet on the concrete floor. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the dark room for the source. Another figure emerged from the shadows. This time it was a man, tall and broad-shouldered. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but Max could feel the weight of his gaze. The man didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to make Max freeze in place. The woman smiled, a cold, satisfied smile. "This is where things get interesting," she said. "You see, Max, you're not just a delivery boy anymore. You're part of something bigger. You've been marked." Max's pulse quickened. Marked? What did that mean? His chest tightened with fear as he looked back at the woman and the man. The walls of the warehouse seemed to close in around him, and for the first time he realized how trapped he truly was. "You think you're free?" The man spoke for the first time, his voice low and menacing. "But you're not. Once you're in, there's no way out. The Red Hawks don't let anyone go." Max's breath caught in his throat. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been naive. He had thought he could deliver the package and walk away. But now he understood. He was in deeper than he had ever imagined. "You have two choices," the woman continued, her tone almost casual. "You can stay and prove your loyalty, or you can try to walk away. But know this, you won't get far. The Red Hawks always find a way to make people pay for their mistakes. Max stared at the woman, then at the man standing silently behind her. His world had just been turned upside down. He had never imagined that a simple delivery would lead to this, but now he had to make a choice that would shape the rest of his life. As the seconds ticked by, Max realized that there was no easy way out. No matter what he chose, his life would never be the same again. He was already in too deep, and there was no going back.